You're listening to the Bail in the Midwest podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Bail in the Midwest podcast, where we explore a variety of topics related to bail, pretrial release, and the criminal justice system in the Midwest. My name is Shane Rolf. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Kansas Bail Agents Association, and I've worked in this field for the past 35 years. Now, the criminal justice system has a variety of players: police and prosecutors, defendants and defense attorneys, judges, court services officers, probation and parole departments, and as bail bondsmen, we have some level of contact with all of these people. But there is another very real player in the criminal justice system who is actually central to the entire process, but who is often overlooked and ignored in the process. Of course, what I'm talking about are the actual victims of the crimes being prosecuted. The motto of the Kansas Bail Agents Association is "Bail Agents Assure Justice." And for those outside the criminal justice system, this may seem to be a little counterintuitive. After all, bail bondsmen actually help accused criminals get out of jail. How could they possibly be assuring justice, especially for victims of crime? Hopefully, my guest today will help shed some light on this from the perspective of the victim. Nina Salarno is an attorney and is the president and executive director of Crime Victims United. Nina, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Shane. I'm excited to be here and to be a part of this. I have a tremendous amount of respect for your industry. So to be able to enjoy it in this podcast is great.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you. Can you sort of give us a rundown on your background and how you came to be such an advocate for victims' rights within the criminal justice system?
Sure. I currently am, as you said, an attorney. I have a private practice, but I also serve as a deputy district attorney for the county of Yolo in California. And I have served as a deputy district attorney through several counties in California. My first and foremost passion, though, is an ardent victims advocate. Unfortunately, it was something that chose my family. We did not choose that. In 1979, my oldest sister, Katina Rose Salarno, was brutally murdered, execution style, in a domestic violence situation on her first day at the University of Pacific in Stockton. I was born and raised in San Francisco. And at that time, victims really didn't have a role in our criminal justice system. And we didn't know that until we stepped into the criminal justice system. And having to endure the justice system, a very long trial, the appeals process and the paroles process, it became very apparent to my family that victims had no voice back then. So my mother, who's an incredibly strong human being, and my father, who supported her, started Crime Victims United now 43 years ago, with the sole purpose. The mission of Crime Victims United is to not only support victims of crime, but to be an advocate on a political and a legislative level for victims of crime and public safety here in California and throughout the nation. We are actually a one-of-a-kind entity in that regard. There's wonderful organizations that help support victims of crime, but we are the only ones that advocate legislatively and politically for victims. And so I followed in my mom's footsteps, who actually in January will be 90 and still comes to the office every day to support victims. My father has since passed, and she and I work on a daily basis to be the voice of victims and the voice of public safety here in California and in other states as well.
That's wonderful. I mean, it's oftentimes, and I'm terribly sorry, but oftentimes it is a tragedy that inspires action from people. And it certainly sounds like they've done that with your family.
Very, very true. I've often shared the story. Just on a side note, when we buried my sister, I remember my mom turning to my father saying, "There's something for this. There is a reason." I have a family has very strong faith. And she said, "I know God did this and there's a reason." And she found her passion. And as to credit, Crime Victims United has been integral under the leadership of my mom at really changing things for the victims of crime.
Well, so what are some of the rights that victims of crime should be able to reasonably expect from their government and the criminal justice system?
Well, I think overall people do forget that in the Constitution, the highest duty of government is public safety, and that goes across the board for any state I am a firm believer, not just because of being an advocate, but as a mom who's raised children, as a business owner, that public safety is the number one priority of any government, local, state, national, because if we don't have public safety, we really can't function. And we've seen that with this crime wave. It's really hurting the communities. It's hurting people. It's hurting children's ability to go to school safely. To Los Angeles, they're having a crisis in the businesses because the neighborhood businesses are being decimated by theft. So I think that is probably the most important thing is public safety overall. As far as advocating in California, like when we started, as I said, victims really had no voice. So we were able to roll out different changes, beginning with just allowing victims to be heard at sentencing. Prior to that, victims couldn't be heard at sentencing. Allowing victims to be heard at parole hearings was another administrative reg that we changed, allowing them to speak. In 1989, we did the landmark Marsy's Law, which really solidified and was the first constitutional amendment that allowed for rights of victims. And we solidified that here in California. Now we're constantly battling because they tried to erode it through our legislature. But what became very key in that, and as we talk about bail, is we did institute a line in there, and it is in our California Constitution, that before an individual is bailed, the safety of the victim has to be considered. Prior to that, it was just the safety of the public at large, which is still important, but this we put in a direct correlation to the safety of the victim. And I was a very big proponent when we wrote Marsy's Law to do that, because with domestic violence, sexual assault, murder, so many of these cases, the perpetrator is an intimate person to the victim. They have threatened the victim if they come forward and stuff. So really, truly, the safety of that victim needs to be considered before somebody's released. And that, I don't think it's any secret to your industry, as we have fought to save bail in California, became a very integral issue in that fight.
Well, and victim involvement in that process has got to be more than simply, well, the jail will give them a call when the person's getting released.
Oh, absolutely. I try to encourage the victims I work with to go to the bail hearing, let the judge hear you and say, this is why I'm scared, because often the judge has not read the police report. They're not knowing that the perpetrator threatened to kill you or your children or harm a family member if released, if you have them arrested. They're not hearing the history maybe behind, and so, or unfortunately, the details of the crime. And really, when the victim speaks, it is much more powerful, especially in a bail hearing, a release hearing.
Well, I know that in the county where I primarily work with, which is on the Kansas side of Kansas City, they have a specialized domestic violence court. And one of the things that they do in that court is I guess they don't really have a mechanism to do it, so they sort of fudged a little bit and would give the victims, like say they responded to a domestic violence situation and they took the husband or wife or whoever was the volatile party, took them into custody. And they changed the law here where the victim does not actually have to sign a complaint if the officer has any indication that domestic violence has occurred. That way you're not placing it on the shoulders of the victim to say, well, yes, prosecute my husband. The state sort of takes that away from them. Also, that takes away the ability from the victim to walk that back other than non-appearance. So they would essentially give the victim a notice to appear, which is a legal document in Kansas that really they couldn't give the victim because they weren't really a party to it. But here's a piece of paper, show up for court the next day, and they would have court the following day at a separate docket from the normal criminal docket. And then the victim would be able to be heard and go, okay, what is it you want to have happen here as relates to bail? Do you fear for your safety? Is it okay for this person to come back home? That sort of thing. But that really only occurs in our jurisdiction in the domestic violence cases. It doesn't occur in any of the other cases that are involved in that. Now, you can make the argument it's more important in that because there is that familial or cohabitational relationship with the perpetrator and the victim. Kind of a question I had is that over the years, and especially to those of us here in flyover country, California's tended to be very progressive in tending to the rights of victims. I think they were maybe one of the first states to actually enshrine victims' rights into their constitution.
They were. Yes.
However, it seems like, at least lately, California politicians have sort of begun treating accused criminals like they're, in fact, the victims of an oppressive system rather than the victimizers of the general population. How did California, and obviously it's your area, and quite frankly, several other large urban cities end up with this attitude and this mess they've created for themselves?
You're absolutely right. Like I said, we were very proud when we passed Marcy's Law and the three strikes law and everything like that. And if you look at the years that those laws were in effect, California actually was down in violent crime. And then obviously, and we look at New York, we look at Chicago, we're looking at California, some of the major metropolitan, that shift for whatever reason in the paradigm that came in under, criminal justice reform really weakened our laws and is destroying public safety. I mean, California is leading the way, I believe. We may have passed New York or close to New York in violent crime. Just alone in Los Angeles County, I just looked at the stats 6 months into the year, they were at 170% higher in murder rate in Los Angeles County alone. And so I don't know, it just came in. I think people got blindsided and misled by criminal justice reforms. I'm not saying our criminal justice system was perfect. Obviously, everything needs tweaking. And there always should be an element of rehabilitation, but there should not be an element of excusing and tolerating criminal behavior. And the criminal justice reform people went to that more of excusing and tolerating criminal behavior versus saying, okay, here's, people that should be rehabilitated or should have a chance at it. And then there are some that, we also need a punishment element too. I think people got blindsided, people got misled. Like here in California, there was Proposition 47, which was termed the Safe Streets Act. And what that did is it actually decriminalized or downgraded violent crimes. So in California, felony domestic violence is no longer a violent crime. Human trafficking of a child is no longer a violent crime in California. Carrying an explosive with intent to let it off in a crowd, like we've seen so many people harmed, is no longer a violent crime in California. So it took this whole category of crimes and downgraded them. It's also what has caused the huge, I think it's all across the nation, but the theft rings, the serial theft rings we now have in California was caused by 47 and 57. So I think, unfortunately, there were unintended consequences from some ideas of reform. And now we're paying the price from it and having to readjust and rerun things through the legislature, which is difficult. The legislature does not seem, at least up until this new election cycle, did not seem in tune with their constituents. They were still doing the more progressive, making excuses and not listening to the people saying, hey, look, we're kind of tired of our houses being broken into, school shootings and stuff. I think, unfortunately, the violence that's happening in our streets now is beginning to speak out. In this last election, the two top issues for Californians were homelessness, because we also lead the nation in homelessness, right, and crime, violent crime. And so I think our legislature has to start paying attention now to the voters and maybe start pulling back and changing some of those unintended consequences.
I did some of my research before our conversation here, and I saw an interview where you talked about where there were like 1.5 million to 1.7 million outstanding failure to appear warrants in the state of California.
Yes.
Now, if my math says that's like 4 to 5% of the entire population of the state has an outstanding warrant, or at least that's, if there's 40 million people in California, then that's a pretty healthy percentage of the state population that has active warrants for failure to appear for their arrest. One of the things that I think a lot of people, particularly on the progressive end of this discussion, forget about is the deterrent effect of the criminal justice system. The notion that if you are likely to get caught, or there is a more ready possibility that you're going to get caught, and there's going to be more immediate consequences for your action, you're going to curtail your behavior better than if there's not. So, I think in these sorts of things, when you decriminalize essentially or de-incarcerate people, you're taking away the deterrent effect. of the criminal justice system as a whole.
And it's not only the deterrent effect, they're actually really just doing a disservice to the populations they claim to serve, the minority populations, brown and black, because there's also a chance for rehabilitation when you are incarcerated. There are programs and stuff that most people won't be available on the outside, whether they can't afford it, they don't have family support to get there, whatever. There is also a chance for somebody to change their lives and have the opportunity to do that. So really, not only is there a deterrent effect from punishment, but they're also vacating the opportunity for these populations that they're claiming to help to have a chance to rehabilitate. I mean, I think, as a bail agent, and I've worked, and we'll talk a little bit about bail, because as a prosecutor, I was always a big fan of bail. I remember working with many agents and their families, where a lot of the families would say either don't release them, or we have the judge put conditions of drug testing, things like that, which are so helpful to these families who have been trying to get their loved one clean and sober and out of a life of crime, because now there's a hammer from the criminal justice system saying, okay, if you're released on bail and you failed to drug test, guess what? You're going back in. And that has been taken away, and that's really a disservice to the communities.
Well, it's one of the arguments that I made. I sat in on a community justice bail panel here, a few weeks ago, and the default position on that is, well, everyone who's sitting in custody that has a bail, the only reason they're still in custody is because they can't afford it. And you try and push back on it, go, no, that's not it. It's not just a question of, do you have $100 in your pocket and you're able to walk out the door? It's, do you have someone in the community, your friends, your family members, who are willing to help you? And as you just described, there are countless instances where the family's like, no, I'm not getting you out. You're going to die of an overdose. You're going to come out and you're going to get in more trouble if I get you out. You're right where you need to be until you get your head on straight. And when you just cycle people back through, you lose that. And I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, because I had more of a question to go over this. It's like, so we're talking about increase in crime. And so where was bail or the lack of bail fit into this equation of how we deal with this increase in crime and these, 4% of the population having outstanding bench warrants for their arrest?
And I love the motto that you have in Kansas City. I often say when I speak, and I'm a huge proponent of bail, just personally and professionally, I always tell people bail ensures justice. And it does in so many facets that people don't understand for the criminal justice system. First and foremost, it ensures that somebody is going to show up for their court date. And from the victim perspective, there is nothing more important than having that court process move forward. I know many victims who are associated with those FTA warrants, or in other cases where the person has fled, and truly justice delayed is justice denied for a victim. And you think about it from the perspective of a murder victim or a rape victim, their lives have been torn apart already. It's been shattered by the crime. There's nothing that's ever going to fully repair them. And we have to accept the outcome of the criminal justice system. We have to accept whether or not the person's going to be charged. Well, they finally get charged. We start moving through the system. And if that person all of a sudden, because they're not on bail and they've been released, is gone, and you don't get your day in court, that is just as shattering as the crime. Because at least if you get through the criminal justice system as a victim and there is resolution, you at least had the opportunity to stand up for yourself. You had the opportunity to go to court as the victim and be heard. Whatever the outcome is, for us, being heard is what is more important. And bail really does ensure that for the victim. I also, like you just said, I think for some of the families of the perpetrators, bail is extremely helpful. And we in California proved probably to the entire country what a disaster it is not to have bail when we did the zero bail experiment during the alleged COVID. Yolo County, who I work for, did a study on during the zero bail period, and 70% of people released on zero bail reoffended, and most of them violent. I mean, that was such a disservice, and that's just a small county. So I can't even imagine in the larger counties what the numbers were. So to take away bail is taking away justice from the victims, and it is jeopardizing our communities. And I think that is something that people actually understand. And I think we also proved that in California when we've survived 5 years of bail attack, including having to put a referendum on the ballot to overturn the legislature. But the people got it. I mean, voters got it. Voters, we all want to be safe. Whether you're progressive, you're extremely conservative or moderate, we all want our families to be safe. And I was really proud of the victims who combined with the bail agents to really come forward and fight for bail. And we were able to carry the message of how important it is. And no, it's like you said, Shane, it's not just somebody sitting in jail because they can't afford to bail. There are safety concerns. There are violent risks. I mean, unfortunately, the zero bail experiment cost lives. The lady that was murdered just before it was going to the legislature to get rid of cash bail, we had a murder on a person that was released on zero bail, and a horrible murder, a rape, murder, burning of her house September 3rd a year ago, and that stopped the bill, unfortunately, but it cost her life, and that's what was really sad.
I don't know if you've watched, some of the original John Oliver Last Week Tonight or whatever his show is. And he was one of the first people to come out, 7 years ago with an anti-bail screed. And he just revisited that here in the last 3 weeks. And one of the things that he pointed out was that many of the defendants who are being released without bail now, in the prior system, they still would have been released, albeit on bond, but they were still getting out and were in the public. So how does the mere act of having to post some sort of security make a dent in the lawlessness that seems to be overtaking us? It's not like we're just wanting to keep people locked up. We as bondsmen still want to be able to post bond and get people out. So the notion of you're just letting people out with nothing versus you're letting people out with some security, how does that impact? I mean, obviously from the numbers we see that it does, but what's your take on how that impacts, future conduct and future appearances in getting these cases resolved and affecting public safety?
Well, I think it's accountability. The warrants that you cited here in California, I believe 97% of them are non-bail FTAs. I think it's 97 or 98%. So that alone shows you it doesn't work if there's no accountability. They're not coming back to court. They're not being held accountable, and they're probably committing more crimes. I mean, that's just kind of a fact of life. So look, even though if the person's getting out, they're on a bond, not only do they, usually it's not them that put up the money, am I correct? Usually it's family.
Right, you have some third party, community support member.
Correct, so you have a level of accountability there, because if it's mom and dad writing the check, usually that person's not going to mess with their mom and dad or their aunt or their uncle or whoever. So you've got, and they're going to also ensure that they're following the rules too, because they're in jeopardy. Then you've also got the bail industry that is also making sure the person's doing what they're supposed to do, because that is your job. So that accountability not only ensures that the person's going to come to court, the wheels of justice are going to be moving, but I truly believe that accountability also helps some people to maybe rehabilitate and change, because then they are being held accountable. They're having, whatever your conditions are. Your conditions, maybe you have to go drug test, or I've done it where they have to attend so many AA meetings, they have to log in, they can't get behind the wheel of a car because they were DUI and got in an accident and somebody got hurt. They can't call the victim of the domestic violence, giving her some peace, letting her get her life together or his life together. So that accountability factor and those conditions and making sure that those conditions are met, I think are critical to the criminal justice system. They're critical to the victim, they're critical to public safety, and they're critical to keeping the system moving. Unlike the 1.7 million warrants we have here, where 98% of those people have no accountability, so they're not coming back to court.
And if they have a cashless bail on the bench warrant, they're just going to cycle back over again and start the whole process all over again.
Correct. And usually they're only going to get picked up when they've committed a more serious crime, where then now we have individuals being hurt. And that's what's sad. I mean, I can't say that nobody's ever hurt somebody when they've been out on a bond, but I think there is a much less likelihood because you have so many people around you watching you and because they have a vested interest. It's like anything. When we have a vested interest, whether it's raising our children or in our business and stuff, you're going to pay more attention to make sure it's moving along. Same thing with when somebody's out on a bond.
So essentially, the argument would be that the bail system itself, a surety or a secured bail of some fashion is a better filtering system. In other words, it requires members of the community that support that defendant to come forward and take, some sort of responsibility for them, be the eyes and ears of society out when the person's out. But it's a better filtering system than just simply, okay, well, this person's only charged with a level 9 felony theft charge, which is what we would call it in Kansas. And so we don't need to have them post a bond. They can just get right back out again. And there's no halting to that. I mean, the arrest is simply, little more than a speed bump for that person. There's no opportunity for intervention. There's no opportunity for the family or the friends to have any impact on this person's life to get them back onto the track that they need to be onto.
Absolutely.
So I know you've kind of talked about this, but let's see if we can get into any sort of hard numbers. Since cashless bail has become more widespread in California, what has been the result in terms of crime? And I think we've touched on that, but I'll let you do it again. I realize that the politicians behind this are trying very hard to gaslight us on this, but I'm very interested in any hard data on crime rates that you're seeing in your areas.
I think you could just look up the violent crime numbers in California that are soaring. Okay. As I mentioned, Yolo County did that study and 70% of them reoffended. If you look at even San Francisco, which was interesting because that was when the first elected progressive district attorney was in San Francisco, Chesa Bodine,
right,
opponent of cashless bail and not prosecuting. And San Francisco ousted them because even San Franciscans got tired of the crime on the street. There were signs down there that don't leave things in your car because your windows are going to get smashed in on every single meter. So even the San Franciscans got tired of it, which says, and now they are doing bail. They are prosecuting. They got a new district attorney in. So that, like I said, the study that came out of Yolo County really highlighted the miserable failure of cashless bail, of not the accountability. I mean, when you have 70% recidivism rates in one of the smaller counties of California, it's over the top everywhere else. The stats have risen. Murder, like I said, in Los Angeles County in 6 months was 170% more than it was the year before. I just read a stat the other day that, and I forget what county it was, they had 6 murders in 1 year and they had 38 in the first 3 months. And again, it was people just being released. There's a revolving door going every which way. And that's really what cashless bail really caused, the revolving door in our criminal justice system, because that with the combination of the downgrading of violent crimes in California, and it was like this perfect storm. So people that committed some pretty horribly violent crimes were no longer being looked at as violent crimes. And so therefore they're getting released on cashless bail and they're just going back to wreak havoc.
Well, yeah, you don't generally start off with, the first crime I ever committed in my life was first degree murder. Normally there's a progression of criminal behavior that leads up to those things, becoming more violent over time, or, if there are controls that are put in place, you generally age out of that sort of behavior, but you also have to deal with when the people are in that volatile time period, the 20s to 35 area where the most violent crime takes place. Rafael Mangual, and you probably maybe read his book since it's sort of in your area, recently published a book titled Criminal Injustice, in which he offered some evidence sort of to push back many of these anti-police, anti-incarceration arguments of the progressive left. I was a little disappointed that he didn't jump on the pro-bail bandwagon. Instead, his recommendation for pretrial was more of a federal system model of preventive detention with limited release. And I think he cited New Jersey as an example of that. From a victim's rights perspective, is preventive detention a better solution than traditional bail, or is that swinging the pendulum too far back the other way? And does creating such a system draw away even more resources from other methods that would actually enhance public safety? If you're spending, $3 billion a year, for example, to run a pretrial release program statewide, would that money be better spent in public safety, increased law enforcement, that sort of thing? How much would a New Jersey type system cost to implement in some place like California? I know that's a lot of questions there, but it kind of gives you a broad thing to go from there.
I can't imagine what it would cost. I mean, it would be astronomical, I think. And yes, I do think, unfortunately, we only have so many resources, right? So if we've had an industry such as the bail industry, which time and time again has proven to work, it's proven to work to help hold defendants accountable, move the criminal justice system along, perhaps even an element of rehabilitation for those that are facing criminal charges. And it works. We know that people make it to court. We know that if there's restrictions on them, that they're followed. And we know that it has an element that protects victims. It always blows me away when the government wants to change something that's working. And that's the best answer I can have. I think when we want to do this preventative incarceration, or we want to change it to this whole statewide system and implement it by the state, and this is probably going to sound a little jaded. I mean, government doesn't always function the best either. So private industry tends to do a little bit better on some things. One, I have a big reluctance because it's just not going to have the same vested interest as bail has right now in protecting society. And it's taking away resources. This actually was in New Orleans. New Orleans is supposed to have 2,500 police officers on the street. They have 420 right now.
Oh, good Lord.
Yeah. And, my husband is from New Orleans. I spent time there, lovely town, wouldn't want to be out there after dark though, right now, knowing the stats. So if you think of that and you think about that in the different states, those resources, the criminal justice system is a combination, like you said earlier, of district attorneys, public defenders, law enforcement, probation, parole, and bail. So we need to put those resources together and use the money better spent, to whether it's training more law enforcement officers and having more on the streets, training probation officers about different programs out there to recommend for defendants, and then keep the bail industry in there. And instead of pouring money into pretrial detention run by the court system and stuff like that, when we have a whole industry that has been built, is in the United States Constitution, by the way. Somehow everybody forgets that part too when they try to do away with bail. And it's shown to work. Why are we attacking this part of it? And we know that when we don't have it, it fails miserably. So that was kind of a really convoluted answer probably to your question. But yes, I believe doing that takes away resources from victims' compensation, from law enforcement, from training for the different facets of law enforcement, even from public defenders and DAs. And ultimately, it takes away from the rehabilitative efforts we can give some perpetrators. Because if we can pay for programs on the outside, then we can, help try to rehabilitate some people.
Well, one of the things you just said kind of struck a nerve with me, because when you look at these anti-bail arguments, and I've attended these conferences about people that, and I've heard the same stories used for different things. There's the story of the girl who got arrested out of state and then couldn't post bond and pled out to something that she wasn't guilty. It was some sort of drug charge. It turns out it wasn't even drugs, but she pled guilty before they even got the test results back from the lab. And that was horrible evil, about bail, because she couldn't get out there because she was halfway across the country. But then I heard that same story used as justification for why there needed to be better funding for the public defender system. So if she'd had a better lawyer involved, or a lawyer who was not overwhelmed, who could have looked at these things, then she wouldn't have had to make that same plea. And I think a lot of the arguments that are made against bail are better solved by having more funding to your public defenders and getting representation for those defendants, either at an earlier stage or to where public defenders are not as overtaxed as they are right now.
Absolutely. I mean, you're right. It's more public defenders. better training for both district attorneys and public defenders on what are the issues, and having the time to say, okay, is this an addiction-based crime? So maybe instead of incarceration, what is something we can do, to, if this person wants a chance at rehabilitation? Better training for law enforcement. I've always said, and I understand nobody's perfect and the system's not perfect. Law enforcement's been under attack for several reasons, but when you really look at certain things that they're being attacked for, it goes back to probably more of a training issue, of how to handle the situation or how to assess the situation. And we're lacking in our training. So absolutely, those resources would be so much better spent. And that's why I said they're attacking. And when I sit here in California and listen to the attacks on bail, I sit there and think you're attacking a part of our system that actually functions really well overall. So why don't we look at what's not functioning and not attack it, but find the resources to help it?
Well, speaking of what's not functioning, and of course, that's my opinion, another alternative to traditional secured bail, sometimes it's used along with secured bail, but more often sold as a replacement to bail, is the pretrial risk assessment algorithm. My personal opinion, these are really little more than a pass the buck options for judges to say, oh, well, I followed this and this is what the recommendation said, for allowing them to essentially blame the risk assessment if something goes wrong. But how favorably or unfavorably do victims' rights advocates view risk assessments, like, for instance, the Arnold Foundation PSA or the Vera Institute, I forget what theirs is called, but their public safety assessments on these risk assessment? What's your take on those?
I'm not a fan of risk assessments because they're static questions. If you look at it, like here we had one of the sexual assault risk assessments was just static questions. It included your name, your age, things like that. Didn't even look at, a lot of them don't even look at what your prior criminal history is, which is always interesting when you're trying to figure out a risk assessment. You would think you'd look at the person's history. So it's based, and they're not normally based on a full picture of information. They're based on questions you're asking the defendant, who's the person who has, it's like we have a jury instruction when you try a criminal case that says you can consider who has the greatest motive to lie when assessing the credibility. Well, that kind of applies to risk assessment. The greatest motive to lie, to look good, to get out, is going to come from the person you're asking the questions. Most risk assessments that I am aware of don't involve family members, don't involve talking to the victim, which I've always thought was interesting. If you're going to assess Rick, maybe you should try to contact the victim and really find out what the story is. So I'm not a fan of risk assessments. I understand that they can be a tool, and that's what they should be, but they should not be relied on when you're releasing someone. That is different. It's a tool to look at, but I think our system has now made it that they're given way more credence than they should be, and they're relied on.
Well, and see, in my experience, and what we're seeing more, here in Kansas, is they'll do the risk assessment, which is fine. The judge should have as much information as they can possibly have to make an informed decision. But they won't simply limit themselves to, okay, here's the person's criminal history, here's how they stack up in these particular. So we recommend the bond in this amount. Well, that's really not your call. That's the job of the judge to sort of, filter all this different information and come up with a number and conditions that the judge feels are appropriate, as opposed to, some algorithm that some company that you can't even evaluate is kicking out and saying, well, this is the lethality score of this particular individual. Anyway, I just and you did mention the part where oftentimes they don't look at their criminal history, or they only go back a couple of years. And I've always wondered, this guy just got out of prison for 10 years. And, he's only been out for 6 months. And so you're going to go, well, we don't show any criminal history in the last 2 years. Well, duh. He's been locked up for the last decade. Of course, you're not going to show any criminal history. But the fact that he's been, locked up for something long enough to merit a 10-year sentence, that probably has a bearing on whether or not he's likely to go back to prison, if he's likely to be a risk to people out and about. All those factors come into play that are being ignored in these assessments.
Well, and the other thing that's ignored in the assessment, they only look at what you're convicted of. And you have to remember, in our system, there's plea bargaining everywhere. So you're doing, rape case, sexual assault case. Well, maybe they plead out to the false imprisonment, the lesser of the sexual assault charges. But we're not looking at that they were charged with forcible rape or forcible oral copulation, false imprisonment, kidnapping. So a risk assessment only looks at the conviction. It doesn't look at, and often what you're charged with tells more of a story than what the conviction does. And I think that's also something very much lacking when it comes to a risk assessment, because you're going to have 5 charges and maybe only plead to 1. And those 5 charges are going to tell a greater story of the person's level of violence than what they pled to.
Right. And there's all kinds of reasons that people might plead down to something less. It may be even the victims themselves don't want to be subjected to going on the stand. So yes, I'm okay. Let him plead out to this thing. It puts him in jail for a while and sends a message, but it's not necessarily as serious as they could have been convicted on if the victim was willing to subject themselves to cross-examination, for instance.
Exactly. Absolutely.
The Arnold Foundation, which is, our bugaboo these days in the bail industry, has recently paid for a study which, unsurprisingly, found that only a limited number of defendants released without bail were actually arrested again while they were on pretrial release. Thus, they make the declaration that 0 bail releases were a resounding success as long as you don't pay attention to the rising crime rate. I do have my own thoughts, I might get into those in a second, on how you could have limited arrest on recidivists and still have an increasing crime rate. But I'm interested in your take on this particular evaluation, particularly from the point of view as a prosecutor.
I heard about that and I was blown away. Like I said, we did a small study in a small county and pretty much toppled over that theory of it being this great success. I think even our California Supreme Court came out and basically said it was a failed issue, cashless bail. And again, that goes back to, I think, the difficulty. You can skew things so easily. And that's why, I was very pleased with our voters in California when they understood bail. Just this last go around in the legislature, when we defeated again another attack on bail. And I believe it's because people really started to stand up because they were getting the issue. So I think it's amazing you can come out, like you said, with a study like that, yet just completely ignore the facts that all across the country, not just California and New York, but all across the country, crime is on the rise. And some of the most heinous of crimes are related, not that not all crimes are bad, but the ones that have made the headlines. Okay, so like in New York, I can't imagine how many crimes there are every day, but there was the headline of the guy that murdered the person in the subway, and all that. Violent record, released on 0 bail. I mean, the ones that are making the headlines that are capturing national attention, like the murder of Mary Kate in Sacramento, they all highlight how the cashless bail doesn't work. Those are the things that are making the headlines. And so for the Arnold Institute to completely ignore that, it just shows to me it's just so inherently biased that they can't see just the facts. They are just injecting their bias to it. And it's just not valid. I mean, when you look at the reality of the world today.
It's like the studies put up forward by the smoking industry that smoking keeps you bright and alert. And then it's like, well, yeah, but there's this other downside to it. One of the things, though, that can come along from these types of studies when you look at this is because when I read over this, I was just simply looking at, okay, did this person bond out and did this person get rearrested for something else? Not really looking at what the crime rate was and realizing that in order to be recidivism, you've got to get caught for the crime that you commit. And that's not necessarily the case. If you get out, you've now learned a little bit better how to commit crime, and maybe you're not getting caught as much. If the police department is overwhelmed, you aren't necessarily getting caught as often doing whatever crime it is you're involved in. So you can have those crime rates increase without necessarily getting a huge increase in the number of people that are getting out. I mean, these people do talk to each other. They understand what's going on within the criminal justice system.
That, and you look at like here in California when we downgraded violent crimes. So for a while they were bragging in California, well, our recidivism rate's down. Well, not really. Created a bunch of violent crimes, so it's not really getting counted towards recidivism for violent crime. So again, it got skewed when you look at it, but obviously, like you and I just both agreed, they just there's this segment of the population out there that are doing these studies or trying to push to, get rid of bail and stuff, that are just ignoring the reality. And most importantly, the harm to the communities. A lot of these studies, a lot of these legislators will say, well, we're trying to help the Black and brown communities because of their high incarceration rates and stuff. Well, in reality, those are the communities that are getting hit the hardest with violent crime, because gangs are going rampant down there. There's no account, we were just in Los Angeles by University of Southern California, which is not, Watts area, which everybody knows, meeting with the legislature because the small mom and pop shops are saying, we need help. We're getting broken into every day. People's lives are getting killed. So they are decimating the very communities that they're trying to say that they are serving with these studies. And I just find that so ironic.
Well, and I pointed out to somebody at one of these panels I was on that, the alternative is sort of a beware what you wish for situation. In New Jersey, the racial disparity in incarceration, now that they've gone to this, preventive detention system, there's more Black and brown people in custody in New Jersey than there were pre this change. So, I mean, sort of if you're trying to go from a racial equity standpoint on this, you aren't necessarily going to get that. If you take away even the option of posting bail for people.
Exactly. And you look at also and I know a little bit about New Jersey, the preventative, but they're also not going to be getting the services that they could be if a judge says, okay, I'm going to release you on bond, but here's your conditions of your bond. Lots of times in domestic violence, when somebody's getting released, we'll say, well, one of the conditions, we want them to start anger management. We want them to, not have contact with the victim, things like that. You're able to put those things in place that actually starts getting services to the person too. And I think that is something that often gets lost in the conversation when it comes to bail is, okay, so this person's going to just get out. Great. What are we going to do? Not only are we not holding them accountable to come back to court, what are we doing to support them? I mean, what are we doing to maybe try to make a change and get the person off drugs and out of a life of crime or out of a violent cycle that perhaps they grew up in, And I think that is such a key piece that when people argue against bail, that they forget about it. Because I'm sure you hear it like I do. I always get accused, oh, you just want to lock everybody up. And I'm like, no, I really don't. I mean, if we can give people services and rehabilitate them, why are they waiting to go to court? By the way, it's going to help them when they go to court because the judge is going to say, okay, maybe you're trying to change and maybe we can do something different. Great. I'm all for that because then they're not going to harm another person. And that is something which always blows me away when people argue against bail. I'm like, okay, so the person's just going to languish. They're just going to languish out there committing crimes versus getting out on bail, having the family hold them accountable, having the bondsperson hold them accountable. And by the way, the judge is saying you got to do A, B, and C in the meantime.
Right. And you do have, in all honesty, you have more immediate consequences for violation of those bond conditions than for the crime itself, because you don't have to have the same degree of, proof to send somebody back to custody if they violated bond conditions as you would to actually convict them of the crime. Now you can argue that on both ways, but there is a more immediate impact on curtailing their behavior if you have them released on bond and have them subject to various conditions.
Yeah, like a flash incarceration, which was 10 years ago, everybody was pro flash incarceration. Hey, a day or two, wake up the person and let's get them back on the road, Right. And now all of a sudden, because everybody's anti-bail, that theory went out the window.
In Kansas, because I want to kind of touch on something else you mentioned about the mom and pop businesses, but in Kansas, there are three broad categories of crime. Person crimes is how it's described in our statutes, and that's basically what we'd refer to generally as violent crimes. Non-person crimes, which would be Kansas language for non-violent crimes. And thirdly, you have drug crimes. Those are our three major parts of the criminal justice system. Each of these categories of crime would seem to have different types of victims. We've talked a lot about victims of violent crimes, the murders, the rapes, the assaults, those sorts of things. But supposedly non-violent property crime can have devastating impacts on the victims and their families. The single mother whose car is stolen, for instance, and now she can't get to work. Can you talk a little bit about how nonviolent crime, because we seem to, let's just shove nonviolent crime off the deal like it's nothing. Can you kind of talk about how that affects the victims of crime, even though it's nonviolent?
I mean, I don't think, I am a true believer that there is nothing that is truly nonviolent, because, people say, oh, it's just a property crime. It was just the box store that got broken into. Well, you start doing that enough, guess on a monetary standpoint, we're all paying the price, because now things are increasing. And it's because of the theft rings. In California, I think it's no secret, we have serial theft rings. We have basically an organized mafia type thing that is smart enough to go around knowing that you can steal X amount every day and going in and doing it. So that's affecting just those of us, the single moms or single fathers out there trying, or intact families, just trying to raise a family, and cost thing. And then the theft, like you said, your car gets stolen. And maybe that's, the single parent's trying to get to work, or the young kid that, is trying to get their life started, and they've just put their savings into getting a car so that they can go to college and go to work. That's all completely taken from them now. And that's a devastating effect. People don't realize that maybe you're not getting knocked down and assaulted, but you're having things taken from you. I've often told people, when somebody breaks into a home, even when the person's not there, for victims, that is such a violation. Yes, thankfully they weren't there, they didn't get hurt, but your home, which is supposed to be your safest place, is now violated, and you lose that security. Your vehicle that you need to be able to function, to take your kids to school, to work, to go to college or whatever, all of a sudden that's taken from you, and there's nothing really there to help you. I mean, insurance companies, great, but they're not going to go buy you a car tomorrow, and maybe you don't have the means to buy a car. So now I know somebody where this happened to him, a young man. He was just trying to get his life together, had been in drugs, got his life together, bought his car, got his job. His car got stolen, so he couldn't get to work. So he lost his job, and we was back out on the streets. I mean, it was just this huge domino effect of this young 23-year-old kid that had worked so hard to change his life. And I think that's what we're missing. Just like what I said when we were down with Assemblyman Reggie Jones Sawyer in California, whose district is in Los Angeles, these mom and pop shops who are crying out for help because they can't, not that, I don't even know if the box stores, but they can't withstand the devastation of night after night being broken into and having things stolen, then having to replace the groceries in their grocery store for the neighborhood. And so in fact, they can't provide for the neighborhood. People are struggling to get food on the table as it is. And it's just this net effect that everybody is missing about these theft crimes, and really the devastation to them.
Well, it's one of the things that you mentioned at the top of the podcast, was it's one of the first duties of government is to provide public safety. And that includes safety from having your items, your property stolen by other people.
Yes.
I mean, I believe the Constitution was life, liberty, and property, although I think it got changed in pursuit of happiness, but the property aspect is there, and that's one of the things we expect government to protect us from, is from being victimized like that. So then that third category of crime, the drug crime, often there's an argument about drug crimes being victimless crimes. Like they're just process crimes or something like that. Is there a downside to simply churning drug offenders and addicts right back onto the street? I mean, okay, we booked you in, let's kick you back out in 15 minutes before you've even come down off this?
Absolutely. And I can speak to that actually from personal experience, having had somebody I'm very, very close with have major addiction issues. And the net effect of a person, again, being getting in DUI accidents, leading ultimately to violence because of an addiction-based thing, that it is such not a victimless crime, because the toll it takes on the family. So, you're young, it may not even be your child, maybe your partner. They're either, have some type of addiction-based crime. Well, the toll it takes on them, because you're trying to help them, then they may get clean for a little bit, then they don't. Then usually when they go back to it, it gets higher and higher in the levels of their acting out. So maybe at first they were just taking, doing some meth and hanging out with the family. Well, all of a sudden that meth craving gets more and more. They're going to start burglarizing to be able to feed their habit, because as your loved one, you've cut them off from money to try to keep them from feeding their habit. Then they're going to get into stealing cars and breaking into homes or harming other people. It escalates. Addiction-based crimes can be they're normal, they are generally really good people that just have fallen into a very bad pattern. But if we keep letting them out, they're just going to go feed their habit. And that's why it's so important. I've worked very hard in addiction-based crimes to say, let's not just let the person out of cashless bail. Let's, give some accountability. Okay, you're the guy, you're now on your third DUI. We're going to let you out. But by the way, you're going to be on bail, but you're going to have to blow before you get in your car. You're going to have to go to 5 AA classes and sign in, and you're going to have to test every 80 hours. And we do those kind of conditions for two things. Hopefully, maybe the person's maybe moving towards, getting away from their addiction, but we're also trying to protect society and make sure the person's not behind the wheel of a car drunk, where unfortunately it's usually the innocent family that gets hit, that gets killed. So I don't believe that addiction-based crimes are victimless at all. And in fact, we worked very hard in Yolo County. Unfortunately, our governor did not sign the bill, but we got it all the way through our legislature. And I think we're going to try again, that said, if it is an addiction-based crime, truly an addiction-based crime, you have your choice of incarceration or going to a rehabilitation facility.
Sort of the Portugal approach.
Yes, and we were really trying to do that. The other thing that breaks my heart, and if you think addiction is or drug trafficking or anything like that is victimless, let's look at the fentanyl crisis. I mean, there are kids dying every day from fentanyl poisoning, and they not necessarily are not addicts. They're just kids at college thinking that they're taking something to keep them awake for studying, and they're dropping. And we are not addressing that. And we are not addressing that the fentanyl dealers are the ones we should be prosecuting. We've turned a blind eye to the fentanyl crisis. I am hoping that, I know Crime Victims United, we're intending to put forth a bill about prosecuting the dealers for murder. So we're going to try to get that through the legislature. And I think it might be the first bill in the nation if we get it, because it's killing, just innocent people, innocent children are dying, and we're not addressing that crisis as well.
Yeah, one of the this year's continuing education for the Kansas Bail Agents Association had a section in there where we had a presenter come from the Narcan people but they were specifically talking about fentanyl, because the fentanyl is becoming so pervasive. It's moving into Kansas more. I mean, it's moving from the coast inward. And of course, it's coming here, and we're getting more deaths. And, so they're really pushing, hey, in your line of work and with the people that you have contact with, it would really be helpful if you have an Narcan. It doesn't cost anything. You should have some. But I mean, they were laying out all those fentanyl statistics. And just, I mean, if we thought the murder rate was increasing.
Oh, I think I heard.
And of course it is. The fentanyl overdose rates is.
Right. I think I heard, and I'm not sure if I know I heard something similar, that there is enough fentanyl in the United States right now, I think, to kill the population 2 times over. I mean, that's how influx it is. And we're not doing a good job. Not only, and I look at it as like a couple-prong approach. We should be educating our kids in their schools about fentanyl and the dangers of fentanyl, especially junior high school kids as you're going off to college. But we should also be going after the fentanyl dealers, and we're not doing that. And, and like you said, your industry could be a player in that, because here you've got maybe some young person that does have an addiction-based crime. They're on a bond with you. We can address those issues, and hopefully save some lives. And it's really very scary, the fentanyl crisis.
It's difficult for us to go to the legislature and advocate for adding additional crimes, though, because the argument is that we have a vested interest in that, because, if you just want to make more things illegal, so you'll have more bonds that you can post. So it's a difficult thing for us to come and be the point person on it, as opposed to simply advocating for a bill that gets introduced. But yeah, we could absolutely do that.
So here's you just hit on my dream button, okay? One of the things, the reason why Crime Victims United was designed the way it was is victims can come forward and speak. Victims can advocate for what is good for our families and our communities. And even our legislature in California, although they don't always listen, has a hard time rebutting that. When we say, hey, so we just had besides defeating bail, we defeated a bill called SB 300. And SB 300 would have wiped out our felony murder rule here in California, which says 2 of you go to burglarize a store, 1 of you kill someone, the other person can be just as liable. You're both in this together. And I think there's a lot of merit to that case. Now, prosecutors use it with their discretion, and they should, but we should keep that book on the laws. So the young girl, the person that was leading it, was telling a completely false story about the murder of the young man. I found the victim, Lauren Pettingrew. It was her brother that was murdered on the case that they were trying to use as the poster about how unfair SB 300 would be. She stepped forward and told that story to the legislature about, here's the real reason, here's the real crime, this is why SB 300 is dangerous, and we defeated it. So I have this thing, and I think, Topo Padilla, and that I'm with PBUS and do a lot of things. I have said, I think victims, we need to start a chapter in every state where victims, bail, and public safety partner together, but the victims become the spokesperson. And really, that's like my goal, is to just go to every state and start this, like a Crime Victims United or something, where we just put together a group of people that say, okay, what's coming up, what's bad for public safety? And maybe it's not an attack on bail, but maybe it's cutting a police budget in a city of New Orleans that doesn't have enough cops. And we get the victims there to stand up and say, no, you can't do this, because this is our families being attacked. So that's my little tangent. That's my goal now. I just don't know. I'm in the process of trying to figure out. I just want to go to every state and do this.
Well, that kind of leads me into sort of wrap up here, because I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk more about your organization and so what are some of the things that Crime Victims United is working on now? I've seen the podcast where you're talking about SB 300 and sort of the pro-criminal approach being taken by Gascon. But now we've got a new legislature in California. Do you have more irons in the fire that you can talk about on a legislative level, or what's going on with you?
Yeah, I think, my number one goal is truly what I just said. I talked at PBUS. I want to partner with every association across the United States and say, let's put this group together. And so that is my number one goal right now, is to do that. Here in California, I'm working with our newly elected Sacramento Sheriff, Jim Cooper, who's wonderful, and to strengthen that partnership that we want to bring bail, law enforcement, and victims together and really strengthen that partnership. And so my goal is to do that in every state, and really just because I think it's so important. But legislative wise, we're going to look at, I was just talking with actually bail industry people and law enforcement about looking at doing a fentanyl bill, about prosecuting fentanyl dealers, which will be tough. It's hard to get a new crime on the books in California. However, I think if we can get one through, we're definitely going to get this one through. We're also looking at doing a domestic violence bill. Currently, when we have domestic violence cases, there's also sometimes often a family law or a civil case that parallels it, because
Right.
through custody issues, and defendants are learning to set depositions, which really is intimidating for the victim to have to go to the deposition and face the perpetrator and be asked questions. So we're looking at a bill, even though there's a right to have a deposition, where at least the perpetrator wouldn't be present, so the victim can have an advocate. So we're looking at a bill of that. And then we have a parole system in California that's pretty flawed. And currently they do electronic recordings. And we just had a case, and it broke my heart for these murder victims. They went through the entire parole hearing and the electronic recording failed. So they have to go through a whole nother parole hearing. And so I'm going to try to look at some type of backup mechanism. So and it's not the first family this has happened to, unfortunately.
Right.
So that's kind of legislatively on what's on the radar. Like I said, more nationally, it's starting these groups. Just so that the legislature hears from the people and hears from the victims. And it's not to say that bail people are bad people or law enforcement are bad people, but you're right. The legislature is going to view them, oh, it's just an industry thing, or just you want to grow your union. When the reality is, if we're all working together, no, it's about what's safe in our communities. And really, that's a big passionate thing of mine right now.
So if anybody wanted to help or see what you're doing, is there a website or a Facebook page or any of that stuff that the people can reach out and see what's going on with you?
Yeah, it's Crime Victims United. I think it's www.crimevictimsunited.com. I had to stop and think there. We keep it pretty up to date what we're doing. We on that too, you also see there's a foundation part, which is near to dear my heart, and we offer scholarships to young children that have been victims of crime or that are going on with their lives. People are welcome to apply for that. We keep updated with what's going on politically, where we're going, what we're doing. So the website, you can call the office. That have the phone numbers on there too. There's always somebody here. We're always happy to help. A lot of times victims from other states will call and we'll be able to direct them to certain places for resources. So we're just available just to be there to help and to partner with the bail industry and law enforcement for public safety.
Excellent. Thank you very much for talking to us today, Nina. I really do appreciate getting a completely different perspective on this, because we don't really often think about the victim's perspective in this, because we kind of get caught up in our own little world of how we handle things. But it is good for everybody to get this different idea of a different approach, a different look to criminal justice. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today.
I was honored to be a part of it. I met your president at the last conference, and Kansas City Chiefs are my second favorite football team. It's not my first, but I'm a Mahomes fan, so there you go. But I really enjoyed the opportunity. I hope I get to come work with your agency and we can do some things in Kansas, and it would be great.
All right, sounds great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today on the Bail in the Midwest podcast.